You can do it. There's nothing to be scared of.
Might as well jump. Yeah, come on, jump. Might as well jump.
Oh, so close. Come on, try again. You can do it.
Yeah, come on, jump.
You got this. Girl, this is so easy.
What are you waiting on? You got that. Come on already. Go ahead and jump.
Hey, all right, there you go.
All right, so we started this series a couple of weeks ago called Jump In, and we subtitled it the 4 roles that every Christian must embrace. I know that sounds pretty imperative, right? That you have to do this, but the reality of it is we learn to do this because of who God is and what God has done for us. And the 2 we've talked about already is we learn to be worshipers, or we learn to be lovers of God because of how much God has loved us. It becomes sort of a natural response to God the more we learn about Him and the more we trust Him and we follow Him, is we think He is amazing, and we think the things that He does are just amazing, and they continue to amaze us, and we worship God for who He is. And then last week we talked about that you and I are built, Jesus talks about this, we were built so that God's Spirit could live inside of us. That's pretty incredible, isn't it? But it also carries with it a lot of responsibility, because as we go out into the world, as Paul says, don't forget that you are temples of God's Holy Spirit. It's like the church is walking around in real everyday life in a culture that needs to see something different, and rather than having to go find a building or a location, we end up finding them. We interact, we work with people, we live in the same neighborhoods, and it becomes one of these roles that we take on that has an incredible perspective as far as the world is concerned, to see something different about God than they normally see. Then this next one is one of my favorites, because I think it's sort of at its core one of the most difficult ones for us to deal with, and that is the idea that we are servants of God. It makes us also servants of other people, and we are stewards of God. So it deals with ownership. Do we own it? Do we own it for how long? How do we handle that? Now, you admit that ownership is one of the most difficult and perplexing things in life. When my kids were little, they did exactly what yours did. I remember, they would be really little, and the first time they had, little friends over, you bring them over, and we had a playroom initially. And that playroom, they learned all their toys were in there, and they also learned that at the end of the day, it all had to be put back up on shelves in different places. And so we'd bring in, little friends, and they'd be there with our child. And it was always funny because both my kids did the same things yours would do. They had their favorite toys. This was their favorite at the time, at least. And so those are the ones that were most important. They want to play with those. The little friend comes over and, of course, has no other choice but to get the toys that this child doesn't want to play with. That's just the way it works, right? Okay, they already got their favorites, and now you have to go get one of the others. But as soon as they reach for another toy that my child did not want to play with, what did my child do? Anybody got an idea? They looked over and they reached out and they said this one word, what? Mine. Yeah, that's mine. All of them are mine. Do not touch those because they belong to me. And that's the struggle that we have. There's something inherent in us that we want something that belongs to us, this idea of ownership. I think it's because God made us that way. But it also causes us to run head on into this conflict of, okay, what about the things that I only have ownership of for a little while? Or what about the things that I have responsibility over, but I don't really have ownership of? How am I going to handle those things? Because you would admit, as I would, that sometimes the tighter you hold on to things, makes them even more painful when they're pulled from your grasp, right? And it makes it even in some ways almost inevitable that you realize it will be pulled from my grasp because I'm trying to hold on to it so badly. It's where the saying, there are a lot of really wise sayings that come out, let it go, and if it's meant to be, it will what? Yeah, fly back to you. You know, things like that come up because it's just a way of trying to say it's just not worth it to hang on to things too tightly or to think all of life is absorbed in me having to have this one thing or hold on to this one thing. There's in fact, I did put this in your outline. What does it mean then to be a servant / steward of God? Because that's what we're called in the Bible. And I'll try to explain a little bit about how those two kind of fit together. But what does that mean? And I put a few in there. Some of it is that you have to own, your own thinking. You have to own your own feelings, your emotions. You have to own your own decisions in life. But on the other side of the column, you have to own it that some of the things that you want to own, you don't own it. And that's pretty hard to do sometimes but we want it. We want to own it. We want it to be ours. And all of a sudden to find out that it's not is sometimes a little bit difficult. So Jesus told this parable, which he loved to do. This is in Matthew 25. It's the parable of it's called the parable of the talents. And it's about three guys or three people. One has 5, one has 2, one has 1. I'm using a more modern translation because the talents, even though it is a great word, because, we look at it, that word is not only meaning wealth, but we also look at it as meaning, what we have kind of inherently as abilities. But it represented in his day an amount of money, either gold or silver. And so here's how his parable goes. This is Matthew 25. It says, again, this is Jesus speaking, the kingdom of heaven can be illustrated by the story of a man going on a long trip. He called together his servants and he entrusted his money to them while he was gone. And so this already reveals that this man is a very wealthy man, and he has people who work for him and whose job it is not only to do his work, but to take care of his stuff, the stuff that he owns, and it is entrusted to them, at least for a short period of time. Verse 15, it says, he gave 5 bags of silver to one, he gave 2 bags of silver to another, and 1 bag of silver to the last, dividing it in proportion to their, say it with me, to their what? Their abilities. He didn't say to their faithfulness. He said to their abilities, and then he left to go on his trip. I think it's a pretty fair illustration of life, even though the reality of it is a lot of us don't like this reality of life. That some people have more abilities, some people have different abilities, some people have abilities that we say we wish we had, and then there are a lot of people around you that you're glad you didn't have their abilities, right? Because you think that would be boring. I have friends who have done so well as accountants. I love math. I'm good at math. I do not want to be an accountant, right? And if you're like that, you're with me. And then you see some people who have musical gifts. And I had friends that had musical gifts, and I had some too. And then I watched them over time almost starve all the time. And I was grateful that I wasn't that given just to musical gifts, even though the ones up here do really well. So, there are all these things that we struggle with why does someone else have a talent that I don't have? But it says that they naturally had these, that they had been distributed, by someone else. One of my pet peeves in our culture is that our culture tends to think or tends to want to believe, even though we know from our own science and research, everyone is not equally gifted. Of course they're not. But we come up with all these phrases all the time to say everyone is equally gifted. Everyone has, and a rational person thinks, what are you smoking, You don't live in the real world. Of course it's not that way. We may not want it to be that way, but that is the way that it really is. And if you look in the Bible, it's pretty clear that God designs it this way. And we ask the question, why this person gets this gift, why one person gets this ability or this talent. Why? Those are questions that God himself one day, will be able to answer for us. But today, all we can say is, it was his choice. This is what he chose. I was listening to, anybody know who Francis Chan is? I was listening to Francis Chan. I think he's one of the unusual thinkers, in our day as a preacher. And so I was watching him in something recorded last year with a guy named Ravi Zacharias. He's a very, very intellectual, real smart guy. And Francis Chan got onto Isaiah 55. If you hadn't read Isaiah 55 in the Old Testament recently, you should go read it. It's just an incredible book, and you'll be surprised at what's in there and thinking, wait a minute, this is Old Testament? Yeah, you'll be amazed at what's in there. But it's in Isaiah 55 is the place where Isaiah actually says this to God. He says, God, your ways are not what? My ways. They're not. The things that I think, how I see it, are not the same things that you think or how you see it. And Francis Chan just kind of went off on this idea, which was great. I mean, he was incredible about it. He says, listen, there are things I read in the Bible. I'm doing it like Francis Chan. I'm sorry I have to do this. See, there are things I read in the Bible. And I say, God, if it were me, I wouldn't do it that way. And that's just the way, he's great. That's the way Francis Chan talks, and he's so passionate about it. But he's right. We wouldn't do it that way. There are things that we say, God, why is it this way? I wouldn't do it that way. I wouldn't choose that. But he says, but the Bible is very clear. God is saying through Isaiah and to Isaiah, just like he says to us, yeah, but your ways are not my ways. Your thinking is not my thinking. And listen, inherent in the statement is, sorry, but it's true for me too, you're not that smart. You're not. God is so much smarter. He is so much better at it. You may not understand it. You might not like it. But God knows what he's doing. And part of this servant attitude and this stewardship that we are called to is acknowledging, just as we worship him, as we become lovers of God, that his ways are higher than mine. His thinking is above my thinking. I see life where I am, and what I'm going through and how I like it right here. God sees the whole picture. And he says so much more than just my life and my existence. He sees how it fits together. And he gives us this opportunity, if we will trust him and believe him, to kind of fit our actions and our opportunities into his plan, which is incredible, isn't it? I mean, I think it's absolutely amazing that he would do that. Well, my son, he was always the one that would challenge me on school. So he's going into second grade. It's about a week before going into second grade. This would never have happened with my daughter. My daughter loved school. She couldn't wait for school to start again. And afterwards, she's, taught and been a professor and stuff too. So she still loves school. And my son was like, hey, I went through the first grade. Do you have to do more than that? Anybody there? Anybody got a child that way? Yeah. It was to him, and it wasn't because he didn't like being around his friends, he didn't like learning. It just kind of, squelched his time. I have things I want to do, and I have things that I want to work on and plans. And you know how big a chunk this takes out of my day to have to go to school and sit in class? And that's just the way he viewed it. So I was in the car driving, I was telling him, next week, you have to go, we're going back to school, so we're going to pick up a couple of pair of pants and things like that. And he says, what? I said, we have to go back to school, second grade. He said, why? I said, well, because there's so much more for you to learn. I already know everything I need to know. You ever felt that way? I say that, but sometimes, listen, even as adults, we act like first graders. It just doesn't fit my plans. This is not what I want to do, God. Why do I have to go in and learn a new lesson and have to learn something else? And why do I have to keep moving forward? Why is there still stuff for me to learn about who you are and how you do things? I don't understand why I would have to do that. But his ways are higher than our ways. His thinking is higher than our thinking. So in this, he gives different talents, different gifts. It's a very real thing to those who have different abilities, very human in this sense, but very real. And then verse 16, it says this: the servant who received 5 bags of silver began to invest the money and earned 5 more. The servant with 2 bags of silver also went to work and earned, how many? 2 more, yes. But the servant who received 1 bag of silver dug a hole in the ground and hid the master's money. After a long time, verse 19, their master returned from his trip, and he called them, catch this, he called them to give an account of how they had used his money, the things he had given them. Verse 20, the servant to whom he had entrusted the 5 bags of silver came forward with 5 more and said, Master, you gave me 5 bags of silver to invest, and I've earned 5 more. And this next paragraph I think is absolutely amazing, because there's 6 things that he's going to say, the master's going to say to the servant, that we all want to hear, we love to hear. And I'm going to be like an Old Testament guy and say, but there are 7 things here that we all want to experience. Here, listen to this next paragraph. This is beginning of verse 21. It says, the master was full of praise. That's one of those things, man, there's nothing like having the master, to having God himself look at you and speak about you full of, just, you can tell he's just waiting to say something good about what you have done with your life. Here's the next one. He says, well done. Boy, it's simple, isn't it? But it's so straightforward. Well done. You did a great job. He says, my good, 2 more, my good and faithful servant. In this case, goodness is absolutely defined by you did what you were supposed to do. You took advantage of the opportunity to do good with your life. You were faithful to what I had entrusted to you and the trust that I put in you. Look at the next one. He says, you have been faithful in handling the small amount. Wow. In other words, to the master, this was just tiny. This was the 5 bags of silver were nothing compared to what the master owned or what he had. You were good in handling the small amount. So now, here's number 6. I will give you many more responsibilities. Since you are faithful with the small amount, I will give you more things to invest and more things to be a part of, because you've proven yourself faithful. And then he goes on and says, let's celebrate together. That's the last thing you want to hear. Let's celebrate together. He is celebrating the faithfulness of the one who worked for him. Next paragraph says, the servant who had received 2 bags of silver came forward, and he handed them to his master. He gave them the 2 bags he had invested, and he said, I've earned 2 more. The master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in handling this small amount, so now I will give you many more responsibilities. And once again, he says, Let's celebrate. Yeah. It did not have anything to do with the fact that one had earned the master 5 more and one had earned the master 2 more, because he gave them in line with what he knew their possibilities were, what they could do. That just means that God puts us in positions where he says, I've equipped you for this. I've given you the skills, the talents, the opportunities that you need to do well here. Don't look around and say, but why did they get, that's not the issue. The issue is between us and God, isn't it? If God chose to put us there and to put us in this place, then that's the place God wants to see how well we do. And it's not so much I know we just get hung up, but shouldn't everyone have the same things? No. Why would you do that? In this case, the parable is all about God taking us through a test to see how we will do with what we have, to see whether or not we will look at what we have and instead of putting our eyes on what other people have and becoming jealous or envious or bitter or all those things that would just absolutely ruin our lives, instead of looking that way, we look at the one who gave us these things and we say, thank you. I want to be faithful with the things that you gave me. Totally different response, depending on where our eyes are fixed, right? Whether or not they're fixed on God himself, the one who gives, or whether or not we're fixed on all the other people around us that we may think they got more, they got a better deal, why did it work out this way? And because of it, the whole sense of how we're going to live our life changes. When you look this way, you start thinking of all kinds of ways to get what someone else has. To have their opportunities. Rather than looking this way, you start thinking of all the ways that you can be faithful with what God has given you in this life. Then the tough part, verse 24. Then the servant with 1 bag of silver came and said, Master. Now already he's going to give himself away, because I think as soon as he starts this, if we could have the the master's response in here, I think he's already thinking, uh-oh, here we go, right? Because here he says, Master, I knew you were a harsh man. You know, when someone starts philosophizing, don't you know you're probably in trouble? I just wanted to see what you did with what I knew you were a harsh man, harvesting crops you didn't plant and gathering crops you didn't cultivate. He is buttering him up, right? I'm going to talk about how wonderful you are and how, you're a man who makes things right. He's as if the master, hasn't been around long enough, is not smart enough to understand exactly what is going on. So in one sense, he thinks he's buttering him up, and that would be true maybe with a weaker person. But in this case, he's just digging a deeper hole as he goes. He says, he goes on to say in verse 25, I was afraid I would lose your money. I have such a great heart, right? So I hid it in the earth. Look, here's your money back. You know what he did? He hid the money that he'd been given, hoping one day that this was just his, that it didn't belong to the master anymore, that it was his. No one knows where it is. It's not like he's invested it somewhere and someone could say, well, I'll show you where he invested. He just buried it in the ground, thinking, okay, this will be mine one day. If I can leave it buried there long enough, maybe the master passes away one day, maybe things change, and now this is all just mine. And his own greed, it just sort of takes over him. But look at the response of the master, verse 26. He says, but the master replied, you wicked and lazy servant. If you knew I harvested crops I didn't plant and gathered crops I didn't cultivate, why didn't you deposit my money in the bank? At least I could have gotten some interest on it. Then he ordered, take the money from this servant, catch this, and give it to the one with 10 bags of silver. So now this guy's got 11 bags of silver. This guy has none. He says in verse 29, to those who use well what they are given, even more will be given. And they will have say this with me, that means they have the ability, like the master, to even be generous in their own realm. But from those who do nothing, even what little they have will be taken away. Listen, I know current culture, which is often happens, what is in the Bible goes against current culture. That we just look at it and say, but that isn't fair. Listen, there's nothing that could be fairer than what he just said. There's nothing that could be fair. It wasn't that the one who now has none and had one, it wasn't that he wasn't given anything. This was all because of how he used it, how he saw it, how he wanted to hide it so that it would just be his. In other words, in one sense, he was just trying to figure out a way to steal it from the master, that it was his. Now, the reason I say that as far as culture, because this is where you and I battle. I battle just like you do. In this culture, there's this idea, if you have a lot, and you own a lot and you have a lot of resources, you're an important person. So the goal is to get as much as you can for yourself, because then people come to you, they ask you for things, they seek you out. You become important because you have a lot. And so the temptation is to go out there and just try to get it for yourself because it changes my status. And that philosophy or that way of looking at life excludes God from the picture. It does. It's realistic in the way the culture works and the world works, but there's no way you can have that idea and put God back into the picture. When God comes back in the picture, the whole equation changes, doesn't it? Of course it does. Because all of a sudden there's this faithfulness to God. There's this idea that you realize is, even if I own it, I don't own it for very long. This is still a test for me. Even Jesus said, listen, don't store up for yourselves treasure on earth that rot, moths will eat it, people will steal it and take it. You can't keep it. He said, instead, why not build a treasure in heaven? He's talking about how God sees you and how God looks at you and what God would entrust with you or to you because of how faithful you are with it. Can I tell you one thing about life that is just a wonderful thing about life? No matter what you have done or how faithful you've been or how unfaithful you have been, because every one of us would say, I fall into both categories, maybe one more than the other. Listen, we always have a chance. We always have a chance to trust God and to live differently with our lives. But every one of us in that chance, the chance always starts with what you have when? Now, right. That's where it always starts. It cannot be, God, I will be faithful to you if you just let me win the lottery. Doesn't work that way. God, I'll be faithful to you if you let me win some award and people recognize how wonderful I am. Just think of how that would motivate me so much. Then I would be faithful to you. But I'm not faithful to you now because I don't get those accolades. It doesn't work that way. That's not actually what God looks for. God looks for someone that looks to Him. It says, you gave me these things. Doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. You gave me these things. So I will be faithful to you with what I have, trusting and entrusting myself to the one who judges fairly and compassionately. That's the one that I'll look to. So I'm going to give you 4 things. This is kind of my summary of this, and I just kind of pulled out a few things. You could probably come up with more than that, but I pulled out 4 because I only have a limited amount of time. And as far as what it means to be a servant or a steward of God, let me give you a few quickly. First of all, it means putting God's interest above my own. It's not that I don't have interest. It's not that you don't own things or have things. Of course you do. But it means that you consciously say, and you have to deal with the fact that, God is bigger, smarter, better than I am. I'm going to put His interest above my own. And the truth is, when I do that, it's in my best interest to put God's interest above mine. Here's what Paul writes in Corinthians. He's talking about himself and Apollos and those who are with him. He says, so look at Apollos and me as mere, catch this, mere what? Servants of Christ. He says, that's all we are. They were leaders. They were very important. And he's not lowering himself in this sense. Paul is actually just making it clear who they serve so that as you and I live our life, if you look at Paul and Apollos, say, I'd like to be like them. Okay, great. We're just mere servants of Christ. And he goes on to say, and who have been put in charge of explaining God's mysteries. In the literal language, he uses the word right there. That word is the word for stewards. We are servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. That's what it literally says. He says, this is our job. This is our responsibility before God. This is what He has entrusted to us. And he adds in verse 2, now a person who is a steward, who is put in charge as a manager, must be, say it with me, that's the number one requirement, that you understand who has given you these things, what He has given you, why He has given them to you, and you do the best that you can to be faithful to the one who gave you these things. And that's what he says they were doing. Second thing is, I think this is pretty important. My time in charge in this life, whether it's a parent or someone who owns property or money, or you have a position in a company where you oversee, my time in charge might be a limited opportunity. Because life is more than just this life. And so God, He puts us through and He takes us through tests, not only for us to learn, but for us to understand ourselves and learn and grow through that. Jesus says this. He says, the man who is faithful in, say this with me, in what? Little things will be faithful in what? Sure. And this just is a principle. That if you want to put somebody in charge of big things, don't take someone who is not faithful in little things and give. No one would do that, or at least they won't survive very long if they do. And he says, and the man who cheats in little things will cheat in big things too. So that if you are not fit to be trusted to deal with the wicked wealth of this world, who will trust you with true riches? And if you're not trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? In the Old Testament, one of my favorite characters is Joseph. You know Joseph in the Old Testament? And Joseph's story, the picture of his life, is such a picture of what it means to be faithful to God and how God elevates out of that. So he's a favored son. He is sold by his brothers to some slave traders who take him to Egypt. They sell him there. He becomes a servant or a slave of a guy named Potiphar, who is in a high position with Pharaoh. He is faithful in that position, even though he had so many reasons not to be faithful. He could have looked at it and said, God, my brothers who did wickedness they have it better than I do. The reality of the story when you get to the end of the story is, no, they didn't. But that's because his ways are higher than ours. He sees what we do not see or what we don't understand. So he's faithful in this relationship to Potiphar. Potiphar's household prospers because of it. He is betrayed by Potiphar's wife, who is also now attracted to him and wants him. He will not betray Potiphar or God in going after her, and so he is put in prison. Now it could look even worse. He could say, I was faithful, and now where am I? But instead, what does Joseph do? This is what he has learned in these difficult, constrained times. He knew one thing: I'm going to be faithful where I am. And so the guy who's in charge of the jails, it says it wasn't long before he put Joseph in charge. Why? Because Joseph's faithful. He'll do the work. He'll take care of it. I can trust him. He is a trustworthy person. And so if you know the story, Pharaoh has some bad dreams, and so he's looking for somebody to interpret. Eventually, Joseph is brought. He interprets. He tells him the answer to his dreams: 7 years of great prosperity and 7 years of famine. And now Pharaoh has a dilemma. Who do I put in charge of all Egypt, the great and powerful Egypt, during the time of great prosperity, so that when the time of famine comes, we will be taken care of? And I know you may think, what? That's easy. That's really hard. Because in times of great prosperity, we tend to think famine would never come. And we tend to become extravagant, and we tend to become wasteful with what we have, and we don't prepare for the other times. And so he says, there's no one who works for me. This is what Pharaoh says. There are none of my officials, no one of all great Egypt in the government position, no one I would put in charge of it. No one's faithful enough. There's no way. He says, there's this foreigner, this Hebrew, who has spent a lot of years as a slave and then a lot of years as a slave, now thrown in prison. And he has always been, say it with me, he's always been what? Faithful. Always been trustworthy. Listen, if you can be faithful in that, in what he was doing, he'll be faithful in this if I give him all of this. And if you know the story, that's exactly what happens. Joseph is put in charge of all of Egypt, not answering to anyone except Pharaoh himself during the 7 years of abundance, and therefore set up for the 7 years of famine. And he ends up being the person who not only saves or rescues his family, Joseph saves and rescues those who were also his enemies in Egypt through his position. Third thing is this: my gain or my loss is tied to my faithfulness. And that's what he's talking about in this. He says in Galatians, Paul writes this, he says, it is to freedom that you have been called, my brothers. Only be careful that freedom does not become mere opportunity for your lower nature. I like that. In other words, to this self-centered place that you could just fall, only thinking about yourself and what you have. And he goes on to say in verse 15, but if freedom means merely that you are free to attack and tear each other to pieces, be careful that it doesn't mean that between you. You destroy your fellowship altogether. In other words, if we go there and we become self-centered and it's just about us and what we have and we have to own it, what happens is we turn on one another. Everyone else is a competitor. Everyone else is a threat to what I have. And it doesn't turn out well at all. And then finally, the fourth thing, my life then, as a servant, as a steward, my life becomes a part of something bigger and better than just my life, which deep down, if you think about it, that's what we want. Here's what C.S. Lewis, he's a man of another generation, one of the great thinkers and writers who came from absolutely a secular background to become one of the great discussers of Christianity and why it works. And he had so much more even freedom because of his background to talk about it. Here's what he wrote in his book called Mere Christianity. He says, nearly all that we call human history is implied in his statement, that long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God that will make him happy. See, the reason our stewardship is so important, and the reason that the sense that we serve him and we have these things entrusted to us by God, this is this role that we take on, but there's a day that he calls it into account. The reason this is so important because that's where we find our satisfaction, in him and who he is. Because if we're trying to find our satisfaction just in this world, listen, C.S. Lewis is right. It is a long, terrible story of trying to find something in this world that you could never find in this world, that you could only find with God. And then when we find it in God, this world and the things of this world just become something that we use for him because he gave them to us to use. And we use them and knowing one day we get to go back to God and say, God, here's what I did with what you gave me. Here's my faithfulness. And let God himself be the just, compassionate, merciful God that he is. Would you pray with me? Dear Heavenly Father, you are the giver of the things that we have. You're the giver of our life, our opportunity, when and where we came into this earth, into this world. And Lord, we are reminded that you know what you're doing, better than we ever knew what we were doing. That your wisdom and your ways are so much higher and so much more powerful than the things that we could think up or the things that we could do. We thank you that you give us things and that you allow us to have them for a short period of time. But Father, we thank you even more that those things matter, not just to us, but they matter to you and they matter to people around us. And those things give us an opportunity with people around us to point to you, to be the gathering, the church among people that have a different viewpoint, a different understanding. So Father, teach us to be faithful, to trust you, knowing that you see us and you watch and you are a great rewarder of faithfulness. If you're here and you've never put your heart and your trust in Jesus, again, the good news is always that he is waiting. He's looking to us to teach us a different way, to draw us close to himself. That if we would look to him and we would put our hope and our trust in him, he would show us things about God's ways that we didn't understand. But more than anything else, he would help us to have a trust in God with our lives. You can say, Lord Jesus, thank you that you came to change me. Would you forgive me of my sins, my failures, my short-sightedness where I just miss it? And would you teach me a different way? In Jesus' name I